So, Geert, we're still here at Techorama Belgium
Yep.
and all these sessions here. And well, Techorama is known for the deep technical knowledge that you can get. But I think that, as we all know, Techorama is not only about technical knowledge, it's also about more soft skills. Because I think it's very important that teams also are interested in and educated in being a better person, maybe work together as a team. And I saw a number of sessions, and I think it's really, really important to dive a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think building a high performing team is far more than just having the right skills in your team, the hard skills. So let's invite a guest who speaks here more about the softer side of developer skills.
So let's do it.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Lead Podcast.
The Lead Podcast, a podcast for leaders in engineering, architecture, and development.
So we have a guest here called Arthur Doler. And welcome, Arthur.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about yourself, what you do?
So I'm a software engineer, have been for 20 years at this point, which is kind of depressing to say. But I'm the community and culture steward at Aviture, where I work, which is a software consultancy in the United States in Nebraska. And I got that job because I've spent so long as a software engineer trying to solve technical problems that I describe my career as kind of one of concentric circles. You start with, okay, I'm really going to get good at this technical thing and learn how to code. It's like, all right. And when I started, it was, thick client Java or JSPs. And then I'm like, okay, we got good enough at that, but things still aren't working. What's happening? Well, okay, so now there's all of this architecture and stuff because the problems aren't defined right or the things aren't built right for extensibility. So let's go learn patterns and let's go learn about architecture and learn about all of this structure. But things are still not working great. What's happening? Well, okay, the next circle up from that is there's all these humans around it. And humans are terrible, messy creatures and not at all like computers, which are terrible, messy digital things. But it's in that sense, we kind of created them in our image. And software is still built, at least for right now, by humans for humans. And if you don't understand humans, you can't understand software. And you especially can't understand how humans build software. Because, when I started, it was still possible for somebody in their dorm room to create something that was going to change the world. That's really no longer true, right? It takes teams of dozens of individuals, hundreds of individuals sometimes, to be able to create software that can radically shape the industry. Don't get me wrong, teams of small people can still assemble. Where I work, we have teams of 4 to 5 people that regularly do software that ships to help companies improve their processes, workplace automation, improving existing software that has been long neglected. And that's totally doable. But even in those cases, you have to understand your clients. You have to understand what they want, how they hurt, why they're hurting, and why the software they have doesn't work for them.
So what do you think then if you say, well, we have to deal with these messy creatures called humans? So what do you encounter? So what are the biggest challenges that you see with these humans?
Well, how long do we have? The biggest problem is that humans are animals that are social, right? And that means that we interact a lot, we communicate a lot. And when we communicate, we conflict, right? We have conflicts with each other. Like I say in one of my talks, you get 4 engineers in a room, you have 7 opinions. And
At least.
Right?
And they change during.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and the speed of tech is so quick, right? The ways we're developing things, the churn in frameworks, the churn in new technologies is so quick these days that it takes a lot to keep up. And the opinions, as you know, can shift really radically. So being able to manage that starts to become very important for keeping everybody pushing in the same direction. Understanding what conflict actually is and why it matters, and to not be afraid of it is really the biggest part, because a lot of, by nature, humans are afraid of conflict, right? You think about, okay, if you have a partner, you don't want to say something that's going to upset them. You don't want to rock the boat, or so to speak. Or more importantly, if you have a boss, You don't want to say something to your boss that's going to make them think less of you, or that's going to potentially challenge their authority. And the worst part about that is it's not a thing you do consciously. It's a completely autonomous process that your brain is kind of protecting you from saying these things.
Yeah. So but do you think that is like conflict or searching for conflict, or at least having the conflict, is that something that you can teach people, or is it something that you should really avoid?
Oh yeah. I mean, you're going to have conflict. Like, if your team looks like it doesn't have conflict, that just means it's beneath the surface.
Okay.
It's kind of hiding.
Yeah, people are afraid to talk about it.
Yeah. Or they're having it behind your back if you're a leader, right? They're having conflicts and hiding it from you because they don't want to seem disorganized, et cetera, because a lot of people still view conflict as shameful. They think, oh, we should, especially in a corporate environment, oh, everybody's pulling together and we're all, pulling in the same direction to do this thing together. Yeah, but we're still humans. Like you said, we're messy, right? And that makes it important to be able to navigate these conflicts, to surface them. Because if you don't, they're going to fester. It's almost like an infection that could go bad and really poison your team.
Yeah.
That's what leads to these protracted things where suddenly something breaks to the surface and you have two people that can no longer stand each other because they've spent so long working with each other and just at odds that without, correctly addressing the root conflict between them, that suddenly they can't even stand each other to be in the same room anymore. And now they're screaming at each other in the workplace and everything just goes very sideways.
Yeah. I read this book from Lancioni called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he has this pyramid where on the bottom layer is trust. And on the layer on top of that is conflict. So is that true? Do you also see that trust is one of the most important things to have first in your team, like safety, all that stuff?
It's so the phrase that gets bandied about a lot is psychological safety.
Yeah.
And this is a really important phrase to understand because I think it gets a little bit misunderstood. Because when people start saying, well, psychological safety, they start thinking about an environment that doesn't challenge them, or about an environment that everybody just has to agree with what everybody else says.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely not what psychological safety is. The original research comes from hospitals, actually, and researching hospitals that talk through or were implementing these procedures. The hospital nurses, et cetera, would go on rounds with the doctors, and they were basically broken up into teams. And what these researchers did was analyze, like, okay, how many critical incidents are happening? How many patients are getting, say, like the wrong limb amputated in a really extreme case, or things like the wrong dosages of medicines, or accidental misdiagnoses, et cetera. And what she was analyzing was that the teams that ended up having better outcomes seems to make more mistakes, which doesn't make any sense when you look at that data, right? And you say, oh, what is happening with that? Well, and then you dig into it, and it turns out they're not actually making more mistakes. They're just admitting it.
Yeah.
And this is where this concept of psychological safety comes from, because I'm sure you know doctors. They're often very, let's call them type A personalities, in as much as that's a thing, right? Very forceful, driven, especially if you've spent so long going through, pre-med and med school and done your residency and all of this other stuff. And you have an authority that kind of comes with that.
Yeah.
And then you have a team of nurses. And sometimes there's a tendency to just be like, shut up and do it. Like,
yeah.
Or even for the nurses to feel like, I don't have a place to challenge this doctor.
Yeah.
But when a doctor is tired because they're on like hour 30 of being awake on their rounds or whatever, and the nurse, they prescribe something, put on the wrong dosage. If a nurse speaks up and goes, hey, wait a minute, did you mean this? That could save somebody's life, literally. And that's the concept of psychological safety. It's being able to feel safe enough that those automatic protection your brain puts in place of saying, wait a minute, I don't want to challenge. I don't want to offend. I don't want to risk the relationship between me and my boss because it's very important.
Yeah.
I now feel safe enough that I can do that.
Yeah.
When that goes away, that's when you have psychological safety. And it gets described as a climate. which is really what's interesting about it. Is it's not something you can kind of impose on a company.
No.
Like you can't.
Like tomorrow, Monday, 10 o'clock, we are psychologically safe.
Yeah, we will enable the safety for everyone.
The safety button. Yeah. No, that's something that is really hard, I think. So, and are there any techniques or things that you can actually do to start building that?
Yeah, actually, there's a whole book called The Fearless Organization that has a toolkit in it that has it's literally how to build from the top down, how to set the environment. I describe it kind of like gardening. It's, if you want to grow some good tomatoes, you can't just start with just pop some tomatoes in the ground, done, right? You got to start with tilling the soil, fertilizing the soil, mixing in some manure, mixing in enough, peat moss or whatever to get the right consistency so the roots can go, making sure that it's well moisturized, and that you've got enough, whatever automatic watering systems or et cetera and enough light to grow the thing, right? The conditions have to be met. So it's all about getting psychological safety in an organization is all about getting those conditions right and allowing the teams to have enough autonomy to build their own psychological safety.
Yeah, but I think it also needs to be, the leadership takes a really important role in enabling this, right? It's not something that you can start from within a team itself if the leadership of an organization does not is not set up for it.
You actually can. It just doesn't have as big an effect.
Yeah.
Like a team can be kind of isolated and individually psychologically safe from a chaotic organization around it. But that breaks down. Usually that's dependent on an individual manager or somebody else who's kind of shielding or insulating the team from the rest of that chaos in the organization. When that person inevitably burns out, because that's a stressful job, that crumbles. Yeah. So you're right that it does have to be, like I said, the conditions have to be set right. You have to demonstrate that humility, and that the studies on psychological safety have been done a lot by Amy Edmondson, who's the one who wrote Fearless Organization. And she talks about how to, actually, she started a bunch of her initial research was on failure, which is also really fascinating to talk about, what makes a failure different, the different kinds of failure. As an example, if you are in a hospital, failure is catastrophic in a lot of cases, right? And so it's a really high risk environment. And a failure becomes a question of failing to follow best practices, unless you're in a really weird situation where, like a house style, if you really remember the TV show's House, where they're dealing with medical mysteries or whatever. That's a slightly different situation. But in a kind of de facto hospital situation, right, there's a best practice that you should follow for a thing, and the deviation from a best practice, that's a failure.
Yeah.
Whether that's caused by inattentiveness, whether that's caused by, in some cases, tragically deliberate intention, which is very, very rare, but whether it's just caused by somebody not understanding the situation, not understanding the context of things. The leadership in that case is important, where they set those rules about how to talk about failure, and they normalize it is the most important part, because the culture of a company is largely defined top down. Yeah. It grows bottom up, but in the same vein, you have to set the conditions, right? If you're not admitting your own mistakes, if you're not showing that failure is a thing that you do too, or that the entire management team does.
And how the whole rewarding system in your company works, right? If you only reward the people who do not make mistakes.
Yes, exactly.
Then it leads to this behavior.
Yeah, so transparency, openness, admitting mistakes, all that stuff. It needs to, the people that lead the company needs to start showing the behavior.
Yes. Well, and it's not 100%, like I said, 100% requirement, but it absolutely sets the groundwork for that to be normalized in the rest of the company. And it's going to take time. That kind of cultural shift, I mean, even in an organization of only 100 people, that kind of shift takes months, if not years, to pivot.
Exactly. But then the question that raises to mind is that, so you have some, for example, leaders that show the right behavior, so they set the right tone, and the team start picking it up slowly. But then there are some people that are not picking it up. More than maybe there is one or two toxic people in the team that are actually destroying that thing. How do you deal with these people?
You fire them. That sounds
Yeah.
really simple, but Edmondson's research actually shows that if you punish people who break the rules, so let's go back to the failure for a second, because one of the other kinds of failure is the experimental failure of we've never done this before and we're going to try this and see if it works or not.
Yeah.
Oh, it didn't work. That's a good failure because we've learned something. We've figured out this is not the path. That's the Thomas Edison quote. Like I figured out 10,000 ways to not build a light bulb, right?
Yeah.
That's innovation still. Is a failure is still innovation
Yeah.
in that way. You're still defining this path. If it's a failure of somebody not following best practices of doing things like, okay, I'm going to hot code on the database in production and knowingly doing that and not just accidentally doing that.
Yeah.
Those are rule breakers. And what happens is if you punish rule breakers appropriately, not punitively, the psychological safety of your organization actually increases because people now understand where the lines are.
It's reinforcing the behavior you want to see. Yeah?
Right. It's saying this is all okay. All of your this discussion you're having, all of these conflicts you're having are appropriate. This stuff is not appropriate, and it makes this space where people are saying, okay, we can operate in here, and I know where the line is. I know where the boundary is. So if somebody is in there being toxic to their coworkers, not allowing the team to build a set of, the psychological safety because they're tearing down their coworkers for whatever reason, whether that's previous organizational trauma or whether that's regrettably just how they're wired, then that's the place where you need to start taking that person aside and go, look, we need you to be on board with this and having a discussion with them about what the goals are. In a lot of cases, these people, and I would say these people, I've been that person. Like that's been the stupidest part about talking about all this stuff I do is it's been a slow process of learning I was wrong for basically the last 10 years or for the 10 years prior to when I started speaking.
Yeah, but I think when you get to a level that you see those things from yourself, that's a great learning experience as well, right? It's really a journey that you can look back on of actual growth.
Yeah, but it doesn't make me any less sad about having been that person previously.
Yeah.
But it means I do understand that person. And on a lot of these people, this is one more thing from corporate that I have to follow and they don't understand. And they've never really worked in an environment. They've only worked in environments where there's that, there's the idea of a meritocracy or the best idea wins by basically combat, like their Pokemon, which isn't really how this works at all. Because they have misunderstandings about what conflict is. And they think about it as this like aggressive thing that you have to go after. And that goes into, they are actual styles of conflict that people engage in habitually. There's a whole axis of this and Foresight that's done a bunch of research into that, where it's one of the axes is whether it's antisocial or pro-social, like it's whether it's focused on the self or focused on the group. And then one of them is active versus passive. So if it's, focused on the self and passive, then you have this yielding that people do where they just give in. Yeah. They avoid conflict by just yielding instantly. If it's the other, like both directions the other way, where it's focused on the self, or rather focused on the self, but active, it's fighting. That's where a lot of developers tend to live, right? Not just resistance, but this concept of, oh, I'm going to challenge you. We're going to we're going to negate.
What I also see a lot of developers, especially very good developers, they have a certain thing in mind and they want to be right. So regardless of any argument that you give, maybe the contextual situations, maybe they are right, but the contextual situation does not ask them to be right. Because we need to choose a different approach because that is the best approach for now. Although they might be right in terms of, what is the best technical approach, like future-wise, but this is the way we have to go to bring people along, etc., etc. And that's where the real conflict starts. Like, I am right. No, we need to go here. And then the conflict starts, but this is not a very fruitful conflict.
No, and in those situations, it's usually best to start looking at what the goals of the actual individual are. Like you mentioned, it's not the person... It's in some cases they don't even really care what the technical thing is. They just want to be right. They want to feel heard. They want to feel like they have some expertise. And in a lot of cases you can still kind of get that. You can admit to them like, look, no, you're technically right. This is probably the right way to do it. Here are all of these other considerations that either you're not seeing or that you're being kind of willfully blind to in the moment. And a lot of the technique here is learning to allow space and time because there is a. Are you familiar with the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems?
No.
Okay, I guarantee you've heard of the sympathetic nervous system. That's the fight or flight or
Yeah,
freeze
yeah.
reflex, right? So when you get into what psychologists call high arousal, which is always a funny name, that's when that sympathetic nervous system kicks in. You're in fight, flight, freeze, right? Like I'm going to fight, or I'm going to just flee, yield, or I'm going to just like lock up and not be able to do anything. It takes about 30 minutes for that system to wind down, and for what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest system to kind of kick in. And this was something without having done any research, I kind of recognized in myself when I used to get peer reviews regularly and have them done to me. And my response was, when somebody submitted a peer review comment, it would be like, you can go to hell. Like, I don't care if you're right. I'm angry about it. And I learned to like, let the peer review sit, just walk away for a bit and come back to it. And then be like, okay, you're right. Like, and allowing people to take the space for those things, to process their own emotions in as much as they're capable of, which some people don't have a lot of emotional intelligence in that regard, but allowing that parasympathetic nervous system to come back on can really be a different conversation now, especially if you go, look, I understand you've got concerns. Like, you legitimize them as they're leaving that angry situation. You know, you say, I understand you've got concerns. I understand that you care a lot about this. And you don't pair that with why you think they care a lot about it. You just say, I understand you care a lot about this. This matters a lot. Let's tag up with that again about this tomorrow.
Yeah. So it's really all about like herding all the emotions of all the different people within your team to actually let the emotions be there.
Exactly.
And so that they feel
Heard.
It is allowed to have these emotions.
Yes.
Then you can if that's the place, then there is safety, and then you can build upon other things there as well.
And if you don't do this, and I see it happening a lot in organizations, is if those people are not heard, or then they maybe yield and they will just, okay, I'll just leave this conflict and I will just, then after a few weeks when something goes wrong, they will get back to that and they will say, see, I was right.
Yeah.
That's the response that you get then, because they were not here in the things that for them it was not resolved yet, right? So that will always be in the back of those people. And
it's there's a particular thing your brain does called the Zeigarnik effect, which is there's a psychologist, Lithuanian psychologist named Bloom Zeigarnik, who did this study on Parisian waiters, because they were doing this the annoying thing waiters do where they don't write down your order, but they still remember it perfectly anyway. And she's like, I wonder how they're doing that. So she actually would stop them on the way to the kitchen as they're going to put in the order, and they would be able to recite it perfectly. Like, here's what this table ordered. They wanted this, no pickles, extra sauce, all this stuff. And then she stopped them after they'd cleared the table, had left, and they cleared the dishes. And then she's like, what did that table order? And they had no idea. Just because their brain basically goes, while it's on your mental to-do list, we remember it. As soon as it's off your mental to-do list, it just kind of wipes it away.
Yes.
So if you leave a conflict feeling like it wasn't resolved, like you weren't heard, like your concerns were not met, that eats you in the back of your brain. It's, it's on your mental to-do list. And then when that happens, you go, aha, I told you so, right? And that doesn't make anybody feel better.
It's the mental bill. We used to we have this statement in our company where we I can even not translate it in English, but like you can
put stamps
in a book to save points at a gas station or something. So we say, okay, well, you are putting stamps in the book, and you need to clear out the book once in a while to help.
Once the book is full.
Once the book is full, you explode. Well, not very.
Well, then you have conflict that's unresolvable. Right?
Well, because that's at that point, that's when conflict starts turning personal, and that's really problematic. Because most conflict in a work is what's called task conflict. It's about how we do the work. It's about what framework we're using, what the language is, what the lint rules should be, all of that nonsense. And that's important because that really does define how we do the work, right? And then there's process conflict, which is about, task conflict is what we do. And to an extent, like the technical piece, process conflict is like, are we doing 2-week sprints? What's our processes? And that stuff is actually even more important to deal with up front at the beginning of a team. because the longer that leads, the more like that conflict is often around people not feeling like it's fair, like a misallocation of resources. Like, why am I not a tech lead on this project? I should be a tech lead. Why did so-and-so get to be a tech lead? Dealing with that up front, that conflict is super important because that will instantly turn into like relationship conflict, which is the third kind. That's that interpersonal conflict that's really, really nasty and gnarly. And if you leave the first two kinds of conflict long enough, they turn into that last kind.
And I think there is also the behavioral conflict. So I don't like that you're always being late.
Well, but that's usually
that stuff.
That is usually that personal the relationship conflict that is about. It's rarely about those things.
Yeah.
It's more your brain does what's called the availability heuristic, and it kind of works on what's called saliency, which is to say what's on the top of the pile kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can see this with a whole bunch of folks who've, well, without getting too much into details on it, your brain doesn't often like to say, I don't know. So there are different ways that psychologists can get you into a state where you feel a particular emotion or a particular state, but you don't really know why. And what you do is you just grab whatever's on the top of the pile. Like, oh, I must have a test coming up. Or I have a test come up and I'm worried for it. Or there was a psychologist who was talking about emotions, and she was on a date with a guy who had badgered her into going on this date, and they were going out for dinner, and she's starting to feel like flushed, and like her heart's kind of beating faster, and she's like, am I attracted to this guy? Maybe I'm attracted to this guy. And so she's like finishes dinner and sets up a second date with the guy, and then she goes home and vomits all over her bathroom because she's actually got food poisoning. It's nothing to do with like actually any kind of real emotion in that regard, but she's interpreting the physical symptoms as emotion. And in the same vein, people will grasp for whatever they like. I don't like you. What can I grab that's not that I don't like
you're
about
late or
you're late
whatever.
or your accent or something about you, something personal, something that's salient, right? It's rarely about
that's a good one.
those things. It's about something else. It's about the relationship. I feel like I've been mistreated by you. I feel like I'm not valued by you enough. And whether that is justified or not is a very different question, right? So, I mean, you mentioned earlier also the emotions. And I think one of the tragic things about the modern workplace is often we feel like we have to leave those at the door of work. It's kind of like check it in. If you ever seen Severance, like on the Apple TV, it's a whole show about like you go to work and they just turn your brain into there's an implant they get that like you become a different person at work, and then you leave work and you're back to your normal self, but you do not remember what happened at work.
Okay, yeah.
We want to believe that work is like that, and it's really not.
It's not. No,
Like,
it's not.
I've had a cat who was sick for a long time, like with cancer. And they said like you have a couple of months, and he lived for like a year and a half after that, just getting sicker and sicker. And I mean, not like to the point where he was just getting thinner, and we were having to force feed him a little bit. But poor little guy, like that was stressful, and it was just importantly, it was infecting my work. So I literally came into my team and I'm like, look, here's the situation. Here's what I've got going on. I'm not going to be as good as I normally am because my brain is chewing on that regardless of whether I'm at work or not. It's kind of just working and processing on it.
It's in background process.
I think that's one of the things that I ran into, that when I work at home, the time is so short between being at work and being in your private life, right? You just close down your work stuff and instantly you're at home doing your social life. Especially this became more and more during COVID, when working from home was like the only thing. And before COVID, I worked occasionally from home, and I had quite some commute time and traveling home, and sitting in the car. That also allows me to just wind down all the work stuff and gradually moving into your social life and processing certain things, rethinking, and then that made it a lot easier for me. And when I work remotely a lot for some assignments, then it's actually harder.
I know a lot of folks who do a fake commute during the
Yeah.
pandemic, where they were like, you just go walk up and down your own stairs for like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, and there you sit, and it's one of those things you look at, and I can hear the old me in my head going, that sounds really dumb.
Yeah.
And the new me in my head is like, yeah, it is really dumb, but it works. Like, that's
So we almost need to wrap up. So we're almost a half an hour in already. I can speak about this, I think, for a day. So
because it's such an
important, and you have so much good stories to tell. So I'm almost want to invite you back one day to have more stories. But
anytime.
so to wrap this up, like if you're now listening to the podcast and you are in an organization with a number of teams and there is some things in your team that are not going well, or you do not feel completely safe. So what would be the biggest tip or like starting point for people to like, hey, start investing in this?
I mean, I would start with Amy Edmondson's book, which I'm not a co-author or anything, so I don't get any paid or any referrals, but it is really well written, and it's really literally broken down to a point of like, there's a whole section of the book that's literally called the toolkit. You can skip the rest of the book and start there. If you just want to start with I'm already on board, what do I do with it? If you're not on board, the rest of the book will hopefully get you there. But it all depends on some degree of control, right? If you run a team, if you manage a team, starting to work those moments of making people feel heard, of you can't just walk in and be like, well, we're all psychologically safe now, everything's fine. But admitting failure, starting to model some of the behavior that you're looking for, that will start to shift. And it does help to explain to folks what you're trying to do. Instead of like doing the puppet mastery thing where it's like, I will do this and then they will do that. That never works.
Oh, but talking openly about it. We think psychological safety is really important. So let's start focusing on this more and then do those actions. So people do know that why these things are happening.
Right. And follow through is the key part. Then a lot of folks will, in a modern workplace, will look at that and go, okay, so we're doing this now. Well, I'll just ride this out because we're not going to be doing this for much longer. If you keep it up for a week, month, a year, they'll start to buy in. And that just by nature of how human communities work, the norms, the behavioral norms of the group will start to affect them and they will start to buy in. The tricks become things like, understanding about the different kinds of failure and what you're actually looking for and what mode you're operating in. Because software, we want to often believe, is a little more rinse and repeat than it actually is. Even if you're doing, individual client installs at different places, there's always something new and different you got to figure out. So there's always new, exciting ways to fail that can...
Yeah, but it's also maybe easier to hide certain failures. And like you said, the examples in the beginning, like a hospital, the wrong leg being amputated, that's quite visible, right? But when you have certain failures within software, there's not that many other people that actually understand the nature of what you're doing. So it's fairly easy to hide those things, right?
Well, that's where, anybody hiding failure, that is a huge sign that you do not have psychological safety, right? Because that is, nobody hides a failure unless they feel like they're going to get punished for it.
Yeah, of course.
And that is a great symptom.
And so figuring out, like, one, are there people hiding it? And two, again, demonstrating that failure openly and finding champions that aren't just you to talk about their failures, other leaders in the organization, whether that's managers or whether that's just your top rock star devs that you got, getting them on board and having the private conversations and whatever it takes to get them is to be champions of the idea too. Because doing this alone can be really hard. And
so if you have certain people showing this behavior and you as a leader then reward that behavior, that's really key.
Yeah, not with you don't want to avoid what they call extrinsic motivators. Don't gift cards or whatever. That's not going to work. But reward in the sense of that's exactly what we want. Thank you for doing that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we
wraps
learned
up the episode
a lot, and
thank you for having me.
Yeah, and really, I've heard about the book. I've never read it, so I'm now ordering it within 5 minutes. So thank you very much, and great that you wanted to be here.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
So for all the listeners, hope you enjoyed this podcast as well, and hope to see you or hear you next time. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
The Lead Podcast, a podcast for leaders in engineering, architecture, and development.